So tonight we welcome Shiken to talk to us a little bit about noticing our storyline.
Hi everyone, good evening. Thank you, Jishin. I hope it is a little bit that I'm talking about, not too much. So this is an interesting chapter here. She starts off with, oh, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay. In Moon on a Dewdrop, Dogen Zenji describes the activities of consciousness as something like bits and pieces of ordinary mind. He says, each moment exists absolutely, independent of its before and after. This means our life is unlimited in the direction it may take at any moment. Is that all perfectly clear to everyone, what she meant by that? I'm not trying to be, funny about it or anything. But one of the things that, when I read Dogen when I was a younger person and was learning this stuff, I would read about, I think it was in the Genjo Koan, he was talking about firewood and ash has its own past and future independent of this and that. And it always kind of confused me. So what I'm getting out of what she wrote here is that all manifestation is an expression of infinite consciousness, that our Buddha nature that Buddha talks about. It's independent of its before and after. We say it that way, and Dogen says it that way. It's kind of a concession to our dualistic conditioning. I think what she's trying to get at is that our Buddha nature, the infinite consciousness, that's our true identity, it's not located or bound by any manifestations or of experience, or limited or confined by or defined by our ideas about it. So each moment is absolute in that it is this expression of our Buddha nature that has no limits. And all manifestation is an expression of the infinite, and in our dualistic conditioning, they're imagined to have their own being, and thus they can have their own past and future. So independent, each moment exists absolutely as expression of the timeless reality, independent of the past, ideas of the past and future, but not separate from the ever-present now. So, in other words, all things are ungraspable. There's no basis, everything is not able to be grasped through our thinking mind. And Catherine's teacher, Reb Anderson, makes this pretty clear in his teaching, that our storyline, it dominates our energy, like she's saying, when we grasp and try to hold on to the content of our story, solidifying the belief that a story is somehow how things really are, presenting things how they really are. And when Dogen says bits and pieces of experience of ordinary mind, I think he's reflecting here on, when we studied Maizumi Roshi and the impermanence of how everything is just flashing by. Science, quantum science is telling us now, everything is flashing by faster than we can comprehend, including our thoughts, our feelings, our sights, our sounds. And they're not really inherently tainted by any traces of thought. So, our stories are basically just traces of thoughts put together And they don't really have the inherent ability to dominate, the energy of our life. But we give it that power. We seem to give it that power when we get stuck in the ideas. We try to grasp the ideas or try to turn away from ideas we don't like. So I'm often reminding myself, Joko Beck said that thoughts are impersonal energy fragments. And I think of that and also add the word flashing energy fragments. They're just flashing by. And in a way, there is no such thing as a thought. There's just thinking. You can't grab a thought out of midair, So there's just thinking. And as Reb teaches, all there is to thinking is the presence of it. In other words, we can't grasp thinking. So I'm trying to tie this together here. Every Wednesday night we recite, as part of Hakuin's Song of Zazen, our thought now being no thought, our dancing and song are the voice of the Dharma. So, we repeat it, we recite it, we chant it. What does that mean, our thought now being no thought? Well, for me, after thinking about this a lot, sometimes you have to think a lot before you realize it's better to stop thinking about it. So I'm still on that. But what came to me is that what this means, he's saying, is that thinking isn't what we think it is. In other words, we think, thought is just thought. No, it's not what we think it is. We can say, maybe it's more accurate to say it's impersonal energy fragments flashing. Maybe that's more accurate, but that's still not what it is. Nothing can say what it actually is. And so we don't know what it is. And, our stories are just a compilation of thoughts we put together, a storyline, And so we could also say, Hakuin would say, our stories now being no stories, our dancing and singing, our song, is the voice of the Dharma. So noticing our storyline, we notice it, and then Reb's teaching is beyond noticing it, we have to notice it first. But just like I'm always reminding myself of Reb saying that bodhisattvas are always thinking, but they don't grasp the thoughts. They calmly offer them as gifts for the welfare of all beings. And their thinking doesn't disturb their deep tranquility. So I think beyond noticing our stories, we can also say that if we're not attached to the stories, we're always telling stories. And Reb tells some very beautiful stories, in his book. And Catherine does in this book too. But they don't grasp the stories. They calmly are offering their stories as gifts. And the gifts of the stories are for the welfare of all beings, and they don't disturb the deep tranquility of the bodhisattva vow, of our Buddha nature. So we offer them as gifts, and then we give them away. We give them away for the welfare of all beings. Just like in Reb's book, he talks about giving away the bliss. We can give away the suffering. And it's also in giving away our stories, offer them as gifts, we can also give away that sense of being a separate self and realize the deep intimacy that we share with all beings. And that way our stories and just like our thinking is not in the service of perpetuating this idea we have as separate body minds. So gradually, we realize that this life is not about us as separate selves. It's about us as all beings together, the deep intimacy of us being all together. And what is that? We don't know what it is. But when we realize we're alive, we know that it is, that we are, and we are here together, sharing this ever-present awareness, consciousness, bliss, suffering. It's free of all labels, not perceivable or describable. So it doesn't need a better story, than the story of just here now. But we don't even cling, Buddha says, don't cling to the ideas of here now. Just be here now. So she says here, our life unfolds when we meet our experience in the present. Categories like hope or fear no longer apply. Our life unfolds free of language and of the linear habits of the discursive mind. When we actualize desire, it is not desire anymore. It is simply the energy of the moment. When we actualize fear, it's not fear anymore. It is simply the energy of this moment. So, actually everything is the energy of this moment, the aliveness of this moment. Another of Suzuki Roshi's students, Kwang Roshi, had this saying that Zen is the aliveness we bring to each moment. And each moment is every moment. Right? One thing about stories I've learned is it's not helpful when we realize we question the validity of stories. If it's the tendency is to get attached to our stories about other people having stories. But our attachment to other people's stories is really our attachment to our own stories about their stories, which is just as much of an affliction as the other person's stories. So we don't need to repress our stories. Stories need to be able to be expressed, especially from the past. Those of us who've been in therapy know that. But we learn not to grasp them. Learn to offer our life to the Bodhisattva way, to the Bodhisattva vow. In Buddha's story of great compassion, he's not clinging to the vow, to the idea of the vow, but he's living that vow. The Sufi poet Rumi had a saying, flow down, down, down into ever-widening rings of being. And those rings of being, that's the energy of our life. That's the aliveness of Zen. That's, those rings of being, those vibrations, that's what our experience is made of. It's the beating of the universal heart. And it's the deep intimacy that we share with all beings. So Buddha's great compassion pervades that not knowing of what it is. But there's another Zen phrase, not knowing is most intimate. And we're all worthy of that great compassion, even though we think we're not. I know I still think I'm not. Not all the time, less. I know I'm worthy more, often now. But we're all worthy by virtue of our very being. The essence of our being is that great compassion. It's what those rings of being are vibrating out and spreading Buddha's great compassion. And, confession is part of it too, realizing that we still have these self-clinging tendencies. But we can realize that we're worthy of that great compassion, and our calling out, our longing is the calling out for great compassion. All beings are calling out for this great compassion, and all beings are worthy of it. And when we realize that, it melts the root of our resistance and our fear. So I'll stop with that. We've got some time to do some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments on that chapter, Shiken. The chapter really spoke to me. For me, I think stories can, when they're clung to, can be very limiting. But if I turn the story on its head, it becomes boundless. If I change the narrative, it opens up possibilities. And it can spin other stories as long as I don't cling to those either. And I think that's why I like Disney World and fantasies and dragons, because it's the what if. I like the what if stories. So what if there really are dragons? What if I could really believe that? And I'm walking in my car tonight and one is just sitting right next to my car door. Do I open the door? Does he breathe fire? I mean, what happens? So when I can engage in all of these changed narrative stories, for me, it opens up so many possibilities. And, sometimes I become fearful and sometimes I become fearless, but it opens up more gates, more Dharma gates to enter. If I consider all the stories, if I change some of the narratives and spin them on their heads, and if I'm willing to kind of entertain them and let them entertain me.
Yeah, thank you, Gato. That's beautiful. I get that. I have that image of turning the story on its head. It's like it's emptying out into the boundlessness, into the vastness. So it's no longer confined. It's no longer your story. You offered it to the Buddha. And also, that reminds me that she did mention in this chapter, sometimes there's kind of a shock. We need a kind of shock to open up these possibilities that Gato mentioned. And it made me remember, I don't know, some of you might have seen this a few years ago during the pandemic. I was watching, and a commercial came on for Bank of America, and they quoted Leonard Cohen. I don't know if people know who Leonard Cohen was. He was a famous Zen student, but he was primarily known for being a genius songwriter and poet. And the Bank of America ran an ad saying, and this is a quote from one of his poems saying, "There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And I thought, wow, that's a big enough crack that the light's getting into corporate America, man. That's pretty amazing.
Shikan, I really enjoyed your talk, and I appreciate your compassionate invitation for story to exist, when it does. And I'm very attached to the story of Hakuin Zenji, and I can't hold back my desire to share a story that I traveled to the monastery that he founded back in 1751. I was there 2 months ago with my son in June. And the story of Hakuin Zenji is he revitalized Rinzai Zen, and he's the author of the koan, What is the Sound of One Hand Clapping? So if anybody's heard a koan, they've heard that one, and no one seems to know that it was actually authored by one specific dude. And this is the monastery where my first teacher trained and his teacher trained, and Soen, Mitakutsu Soen Roshi is in our lineage that we chant every night. And he was a very eccentric figure and was kind of a famous artist in Japan. And when he died in 1992, he broke tradition and chose not to have his own urn, no place in the cemetery where his ashes were honored. But instead, he chose to have his own ashes intermingled with those of Hakuin, going back to maybe 1792, 200 years later. And what a mischievous expression of thought being no thought, no separation between Zen masters separated by centuries. And to turn this story on its head, these were real people. One of us could be the next Hakuin.
Thank you, Dougie.
The irony, thank you for this presentation. I love the topic of the presentation. The irony of this chapter for me is that my children have me subscribe to a program called My Life in a Book. And every week a question is sent to me. And this goes on for an entire year. And so by the end of the year, I will have written a book full of stories about my life. And some of these stories are almost like creation stories. You want to understand who I am, you got to understand at least one of those stories. It's like the dividing, it's like the fork in the road of my entire life. But to keep myself not to be attached to my own stories, I wrote a haiku, and the haiku is, the life we're living is the story we're telling. It may not be true.
I'm reminded of my old Tai Chi teacher, who is also a ordained Taoist monk. He's the only Westerner that's ever been ordained by a particular Taoist school. I'm listening to one of his podcasts one day, and he said, after looking at everything, all I can say is there's something going on here. I don't know what it is. And it struck me that what he was saying is not knowing, and as you just said, Roger, not knowing is most intimate. To just be with not knowing and just being there. And I think that kind of, to me, that's what summarizes this chapter. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
My thoughts are taking me a little bit of a different direction. I'm thinking of Theseus. Theseus was a Greek hero who went to Crete, and he went into the labyrinth. And a labyrinth is a maze, and you go in there, you get stuck in there. And the deeper you go in, the deeper you get in, and the harder it is to get who is a PhD psychologist in the cognitive behavioral tradition. So my whole professional orientation is about thinking. You know, in the maze is the Minotaur, and the Minotaur is the monster. And dropping stories is about dropping stories. Whether I can grasp my thoughts or not is just absolutely irrelevant. Like, the time that I spend thinking about that is the time that I'm disconnected from this moment as it's unfolding. And I've said this before, kind of in our meetings, that you know, we have to be as mindful of the trap of Buddhist stories as we do our own stories. Because that can be just, the Buddhist stories we tell ourselves can be just as much a maze where we get lost as the stories that we tell ourselves about our own lives. And so it's good to get out of our heads. And I'm learning to do that. And because life is not in my head, life is taking place outside of my head and outside of my thoughts. And someone reminded me of this today. There's no rest for the mind in the mind. So the more I think about stuff, the deeper I get into the maze, more often than not. And so I think the beauty of our practice is that it gives us the opportunity to put everything down, to just put it down, and to receive whatever it is that life has to offer, rather than telling stories on about it, getting lost in a story, whether that's my own story or a Buddhist story. So, lesson in Greek mythology there.
It's interesting because the last two people commented, one mentioned Tai Chi, and one mentioned ancient Greeks. And when I read this chapter, both of those things actually came to mind for me also. So the part about our thoughts being these small pieces, when we learn Tai Chi, we learn one move at a time. And this would go for something like playing an instrument. You're learning one note at a time. But eventually, you build up and you have a sequence. But as you're learning, the more you think about what you just learned when you're doing the sequence, it tends to mess you up. And eventually you reach that point where you can let go of thinking about what you're doing and just flow through it. So that came to mind for me. And then also the part where she talked about the shock and that the sesshin could kind of take the place of an actual tragedy in your life or that kind of thing. It reminded me a few years ago I was reading about the Greek Stoics, and one of the practices they had was they would actually think up stories about bad things happening in their lives. And it sounds very morbid, but apparently the outcome of it was that they were much happier in daily life by thinking about those things, and it sort of gave them a preparation for what could happen, but also, I guess, appreciating when it didn't.
Thank you for your talk, Roger. A lot of things were brought up, and I appreciate, Gato, what you said. Also, Roshan, about taking the stories and turning them upside down, and the maze. And what I liked, Roger, was that helped me also was that, you know, offering stories as a gift, or stories being offered as a gift, ultimately, so that to release the attachment
that one develops or with the stories if you don't offer them. That to me that was the final step that was needed. So thank you again.
Way down here, in the back. You really can't see me. Thank you for your talk. Kayla, thank you for your comment as well. I think that the idea that stories are limiting was really critical to me as I read this. It was a story that I found myself in was limiting when I read it. And the liberation from the story was so profound that it's really hard to communicate. That by finding the mystery and possibility and magic in the moment, it was so much greater than the story that I was letting play out. And I felt this very early on in my recent legal journey, which is it is so much of a gift when you get a real crappy story, because it's so much easier to want to let go of. It is liberating to go, I hate this story here, right? But it also reminds you that the good story was just a story too. And that even though that doesn't seem so real, that even giving that good story up is putting this minute modicum of good idea up for such a greater possibility. And honestly, I lived that. It's a very hard story to give up, right? When you think you're doing it and it's all going well, man, it's a hard story to let go. Does that feel straight? When it's all going to hell and you want to give it away, that's simple. It hurts a lot, but it's still simple in comparison. So I just have that's why I really like the giving it away part too. I think that does offer something that I'm not going to be able to express clearly, but I guess I could feel it this way. I'm in Chicago, I'm by myself. It's the night before, I'm about to sit in front of a judge and have him tell me what is going to happen in my life. And I have this deep connection with the song. And I'm standing waiting for the elevator, and the Muzak plays My Way by Sinatra. I was like, man, that's amazing, right? And I only feel like you really are able to be aware of these moments when you've given up the story. Because you're all wrapped up, you're not going to catch it, right? But when you're in that moment, and Sinatra comes on, and you're like, man, it has been a disaster, but I did do it my way. And that's good. So thank you for the talk and for the book and all that.
Thank you, Shikan. Thank you, everyone, for your insights. I mostly am focused on how fleeting each moment is. And years ago, listening to tapes by Alan Watts, who was one of the first Buddhist teachers in this country many years ago. But his saying in this tape that, by the time we realize what this moment is, it's already gone. So it's as if we are continually living our life looking in a rearview mirror, and what's already gone we can see in the rearview mirror, but by the time this moment gets from sensation, perception, reaction, consciousness, it's already gone. So it really reminds me to keep that concept in mind that everything is ungraspable, as Shiken said. Ultimately, it's ungraspable because it's just such a fleeting experience. And so, very interesting discussion. We're a little bit past our time. Would anyone else like to offer insight?
I wanted to thank Jishin for that, because what you just shared, it really jumped these pages. What really jumped out of the pages, off the pages at me, was the saying of a momentary existence. And I remember writing this down and jotting that, making some notes on it. So what you just shared really brought back the thing that jumped out the most at me in this particular chapter. Thank you.
Thank you. Any announcements before we have our closing down?
We have Zazen-kai not this week, but the following week, which I think is the 14th. But check your calendar and check your email. Gato sent out an email, so we're just postponing it 1 week because they're doing an arts and crafts thing here at the Zendo during our regular second meeting.
Creations are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to transform them. Reality is boundless, I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable, I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to transform them. Reality is boundless, I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable, I vow to embody it.